Part 1. They sent us to a godforsaken island in the Pacific, a speck of volcanic rock called Black Sand Atoll, not even big enough to warrant a name on most maps. Officially, we were there to establish a comm relay for the Navy, satellite uplinks, encrypted transmissions, the usual. Unofficially, nobody told us a damn thing. The island was barren, save for a thin perimeter of jungle at the edges and a rusted-out structure that looked like a leftover from some forgotten war. It was the skeleton of a building, its roof caved in, the walls pockmarked with corrosion and bullet holes. The locals had long since abandoned the place, if there had ever been any. Even the seabirds seemed to avoid it. We were a team of 6, Specialist Rourke, our comms guy, Sergeant Wells, who didn't believe in jokes, Doc Meyer, our medic who chain-smoked like the air would kill him anyway, and the rest of us grunts. I was one of them, just following orders. Our first night was uneventful, aside from the static. It came through Rourke's equipment like a whisper at first. We thought it was just interference from the storm brewing offshore, the kind of thing you learn to tune out. But as the night deepened, so did the sound. It wasn't random, though. There was a rhythm to it, almost like words, though none of us could make them out. Rourke stayed up late, hunched over the equipment, fiddling with dials and muttering to himself. Something's bouncing the signal. He told me when I brought him some coffee around 2 a.m., but there's nothing out there, just water and sky. Maybe it's bouncing off the clouds, I suggested. He shook his head. That's not how this works. By morning, the static had gone, but Rourke looked pale, like he hadn't slept. He swore the signal had turned into a voice at some point, soft and low, but I didn't press him on it. We all heard strange things in places like this, your mind playing tricks on you after too many hours staring at nothing. Day 2, we set up the relay. Standard protocol, antennas on the high ground, base camp near the shoreline. But the jungle had other ideas. It was thicker than it looked, and the deeper we went, the more wrong it felt. The air grew heavy, not just with heat, but with a weight I couldn't explain. It was silent, too. No insects, no birds, just the crunch of our boots on the undergrowth. We found something buried in the jungle. A stone pillar, old and worn, carved with symbols none of us recognized. It looked ancient, predating the rusted building near the shore. Wells ordered us to leave it alone, and we didn't argue. Something about it made my skin crawl. That night, the static returned. This time, we all heard it. The voice came in bursts, like something struggling to form words. Rourke recorded it, his hands shaking as he played it back. It wasn't in English or any language I knew. It was guttural, low, but there was intent behind it, like it was trying to get our attention. "Turn it off," Wells barked, and Rourke obeyed. But the voice didn't stop. It wasn't coming from the equipment anymore. We tried to convince ourselves it was the storm, the wind, the surf, maybe just our imaginations. But deep down, we all knew better. The voice wasn't coming from the comms gear anymore. It was outside. We huddled around the makeshift fire we'd set up on the beach, weapons within arm's reach. The storm clouds boiled on the horizon, flashes of lightning carving jagged silhouettes of the jungle against the night sky. The air smelled of ozone and damp earth. Wells was on edge, pacing the perimeter like a caged animal. "It's just static," he said, more to himself than to us. "We're tired, that's all." But no one was buying it. Even Doc Meyer, who never gave a damn about anything but his cigarettes, kept glancing over his shoulder toward the tree line. Around midnight, the sound started again. It wasn't a voice this time, not exactly. It was more like a vibration, a low hum that you felt in your chest rather than heard with your ears. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, rolling over us like a wave. Then came the lights. At first, I thought it was lightning, but these weren't flashes, they were pulses. Soft, greenish glows, faint and distant, deep in the jungle. They flickered in and out, erratic, like something trying to signal us. Rourke swore under his breath and started fiddling with his gear again, desperate to make sense of it. "There's nothing out there," he muttered. "No transmitters, no power sources, nothing." "Then what the hell is it?" I asked. He didn't answer. Wells finally had enough. "Gear up," he ordered, his voice tight with barely contained anger. "We're going to check it out." None of us argued. What else could we do? The alternative was sitting there, waiting for whatever was out there to come to us. The jungle felt different at night, colder somehow even in the suffocating humidity. Our flashlights carved narrow tunnels through the darkness, but the green pulses were gone. Only the hum remained, vibrating in the pit of my stomach. Every shadow seemed to move just out of sight, every sound amplified by the suffocating silence. We found the stone pillar again, though none of us had been trying to. It loomed out of the foliage like a gravestone, its carvings now clearly visible under the beams of our flashlights. Rourke ran his fingers over the grooves, his lips moving silently as if trying to read the symbols. "Leave it," Wells snapped, but Rourke didn't move. "There, instructions," Rourke whispered, his voice trembling. "Or a warning." "Get away from it," Wells barked, but Rourke ignored him. His hand had stopped moving, his fingers frozen against the stone. His eyes went wide, unblinking. "Do you hear it?" Rourke asked, his voice barely audible. "What are you talking about?" I demanded, but Rourke just shook his head, a thin, humorless laugh escaping his lips. "It's so loud." He collapsed without warning, his body hitting the ground like a sack of stones. Meyer rushed to him, but there was nothing to be done. Rourke's eyes were open, staring at something none of us could see. His mouth moved silently, forming words that made no sense. Then his body arched, his back bending at an impossible angle, and a sound tore from his throat. A guttural, inhuman wail that didn't belong in this world. We ran. I'm not proud of it, but we ran. We left Rourke there, twitching and screaming in the dirt. Wells shouted something. An order? A prayer? I don't know. But his voice was lost in the roar of the storm that broke overhead. The hum was deafening now, a crescendo of sound that seemed to come from the jungle itself. The lights returned, flickering all around us, casting eerie shadows on the trees. I swear they moved with purpose, closing in, herding us back toward the beach. By the time we reached camp, the storm had swallowed the sky, the rain coming down in sheets. Rourke's screams had stopped, but the hum remained, throbbing in the air like a heartbeat. None of us slept that night. Morning came reluctantly, dragging itself over the horizon like it didn't want to face the island any more than we did. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still a sickly shade of gray, and the jungle seemed darker than it should have been. We didn't speak much as we packed up what we could carry. Rourke was gone. Whether dead or alive, none of us knew. None of us wanted to know. We didn't go back for him, though the guilt of that decision gnawed at me as we prepared to abandon the mission. But it wasn't guilt that kept me glancing toward the tree line. It was the feeling that we were being watched. We had barely started the trek to the boat when the hum returned, low and pulsing, like the island itself was breathing. The jungle felt alive, the shadows deeper, the air heavier. Every step felt like walking through mud, though the ground beneath us was dry. Wells was in front, his rifle clutched tight, his jaw set in a grim line. Meyer followed, muttering under his breath. Prayers, I think. I stayed at the back, my heart pounding so loud I was sure the others could hear it. We didn't see the first one until it was too late. It moved fast, faster than anything that big should have been able to. One moment, the path ahead was clear. The next, Wells was screaming, his rifle clattering to the ground as something massive dragged him into the undergrowth. It was pale, its skin stretched tight over a skeletal frame that seemed to shift and ripple as it moved. Its face, God, its face was all wrong, a mess of hollow sockets and jagged angles that didn't belong on anything natural. We froze, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what we were seeing. Then Meyer broke, screaming as he raised his pistol and fired wildly into the trees. The thing didn't even flinch. I grabbed Meyer, pulling him back down the path as the thing disappeared into the jungle with Wells. His screams faded quickly, swallowed by the hum that seemed to grow louder with every passing second. We ran. The jungle closed in around us, the trees twisting and shifting as if trying to trap us. The hum was everywhere now, vibrating in my skull, in my bones, in the very air I breathed. I could barely think, barely see. When we burst out onto the beach, it felt like coming up for air after nearly drowning. The boat was still there, bobbing gently in the surf, and for a brief moment, I thought we might make it. Then the lights appeared. They rose from the water, swirling and dancing like will-o'-the-wisps, cutting off our path to the boat. Meyer stopped short, his breath hitching as the lights moved closer, circling us like sharks. "They're not alive," Meyer whispered, his voice trembling. "There's something else." I didn't have time to ask what he meant before one of the lights darted toward him. He screamed as it hit him, his body convulsing violently before crumpling to the sand. I ran, tears streaming down my face, the hum pounding in my ears. The last thing I saw before I reached the boat was Meyer's body. The light had consumed him, leaving behind only ash and bone. The engine roared to life under my trembling hands, and I sped away from the island as fast as the boat would carry me. The hum followed me for a while, fading slowly as the island disappeared into the mist. When I reached the Navy outpost on the mainland, I told them everything. They didn't believe me, of course. They called it a combat stress reaction, said I was hallucinating. They said the island was uninhabited, that there was no ancient stone pillar, no lights, no hum. They said my team had disappeared in the storm, lost to the elements. But I know the truth. The island wasn't abandoned. It was waiting, and now it knows we're here. Part 2. It started like any other rotation. The base was a skeleton crew post deep in the Appalachian wilderness, the kind of place where they send people who've either screwed up or pissed off the wrong higher-ups. For me, it was neither. I was just unlucky. The station wasn't even marked on most maps. A Cold War relic equipped with old tech that had no place in the 21st century. Officially, we were monitoring radio frequencies for anomalous signals, something about maintaining national readiness. In practice, we spent most of our time drinking coffee and playing cards, occasionally logging static that nobody would ever read. I'd been there 3 weeks when the signal came. It was after midnight, and I was alone in the control room. Staff Sergeant Martinez was asleep in the barracks, and Corporal Hayes was on patrol, trudging through the endless fog that always seemed to cling to the base. I had the radio headset on, one ear listening to the usual hiss of white noise while the other ear caught the low hum of the ancient servers that lined the room. Then I heard it, a voice. It was faint, buried under layers of static, but it was there, clear enough to make my stomach drop. I yanked the headset off and turned up the external speakers. The sound filled the room, distorted and hollow, but unmistakably human. A single word, repeated over and over. "Help!" I scrambled to record the transmission, my hands shaking as I adjusted the dials. The signal wavered, fading in and out, but the voice never stopped. It was male, desperate, and wrong, like it was coming from somewhere it shouldn't have been. I called Martinez, my voice cracking as I tried to explain. She stumbled in a few minutes later, still half asleep, her hair a mess under her cap. "You better not be messing with me," she muttered. But her tone changed when she heard the voice for herself. "What the hell is that?" she asked, her eyes darting to the ancient radar screen as if expecting it to show something. I shook my head. "I don't know. It's coming from somewhere north. But it's not local. It's too strong." Hayes radioed in from his patrol, his voice tight with concern. "You guys hearing this? It's all over the shortwave." I thought it was interference, but it's not. We triangulated the source, A routine task we'd done a dozen times with no result. This time, though, it worked. The coordinates led to a valley about 15 miles from the base. A place we knew was empty. Just trees and rocks for miles around. Except, maybe it wasn't empty. We debated calling it in, but Martinez shut that down quick. You know what they'll say. We'll get chewed out for wasting resources. Let's check it out ourselves first. So we loaded into the Humvee, armed to the teeth but with no real idea why. The signal still played in the background, that haunting plea for help looping endlessly. It felt wrong to leave it behind, like turning off the voice would make it vanish forever. The drive was slow, the terrain rough and the fog thicker than I'd ever seen it. The road seemed to twist unnaturally, doubling back on itself and leading us in circles until we were all on edge. It was Hayes who finally broke the silence. "Doesn't this feel off to you?" he asked, gripping his rifle like it was the only solid thing in the world. Martinez didn't answer, her jaw set in that hard line she wore when she was scared but didn't want anyone to know it. I felt it too, though, something in the air, like static crawling over my skin. The closer we got to the coordinates, the stronger it became, until my teeth were buzzing and my hands were shaking on the wheel. We stopped when the road gave out, the Humvee's tires sinking into soft earth. The valley stretched out before us, shrouded in mist, the trees looming like twisted shadows against the pale glow of the moon. And then we saw it. A single radio tower, ancient and rusted, standing in the center of the clearing. Its dish was cracked, its wires tangled, but it was alive, blinking red like a heartbeat. The signal was coming from there, but the tower wasn't supposed to exist. We stepped out of the Humvee, and the air hit me like a physical force, thick, metallic, and electric, like the seconds before a lightning strike. The fog clung to us, muffling sound and making everything feel unreal. The tower loomed ahead, skeletal and wrong against the mist. Its red light blinked methodically, each pulse casting eerie shadows that flickered and danced like something alive. "Looks abandoned," Hayes whispered, though his grip on his rifle told a different story. "So what's powering it?" Good question. The thing looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Rust streaked every surface, and the dish at the top sagged under its own weight. But the signal was unmistakable, stronger than ever. A looping cry for help that seemed to echo in my skull, even when I wasn't wearing the headset. "Stay sharp," Martinez ordered, her voice low and tense. This could be some kind of trap. Trap? By who? The closest town was 40 miles away, and no one was supposed to even know this valley existed. But I kept my thoughts to myself and followed as Martinez led us toward the tower. The closer we got, the more I noticed details. Things that shouldn't have been there. Deep gouges in the earth around the base of the tower, like something had been dragged, repeatedly. The ground was littered with pieces of old equipment, all smashed to hell, their wires frayed and dangling like veins. And then there were the symbols. They were carved into the metal legs of the tower, crude and chaotic, like something scratched out in a frenzy. At first glance, they looked random, just jagged shapes, but the longer I stared, the more I felt like they were watching me. I turned away, my stomach churning. "Check this out," Hayes called from behind the tower. I joined him and instantly regretted it. The drag marks led to an open hatch in the ground, a jagged tear that seemed to lead into darkness itself. It wasn't part of the tower, not originally anyway. The edges were rough, the metal warped as if the hatch had been forced open from below. A ladder descended into the black, its rungs slick with something I didn't want to identify. "Hell no," I muttered. "We're here to investigate," Martinez snapped, her tone sharp enough to make me flinch. "Hayes, you're on point. I'll cover the rear." I wanted to argue, but I knew better. Martinez wasn't the type to listen to fear, no matter how justified it was. So I followed Hayes as he swung himself onto the ladder and began the climb down. The air grew colder as we descended, the metallic tang giving way to something dank and earthy. My boots scraped against the ladder's rungs, and the sound echoed in the narrow shaft, amplifying the tension coiling in my chest. We hit the bottom after what felt like an eternity. The space below was a narrow tunnel, just wide enough for us to walk single file. The walls were smooth, like they'd been melted rather than carved, and the floor was littered with debris. Broken glass, fragments of equipment, more of those symbols scratched into every surface. And the hum, God, the hum was unbearable down here. A constant vibration that seemed to seep into my bones. The signal was stronger, louder, its loop almost deafening. "Where's it coming from?" I asked, my voice shaking. Hayes pointed ahead, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The tunnel widened into a cavern, and at the center of it was something I couldn't wrap my head around. It was a machine, but not like any I'd ever seen. A tangled mass of wires, screens, and gears, all glowing faintly with an unnatural light. It pulsed in time with the signal as if it were alive. "What the hell is this?" Hayes whispered, stepping closer. Martinez grabbed his arm, her eyes fixed on the machine. "Don't touch it. Don't." Too late. Hayes reached out, his fingers brushing against one of the wires. The room exploded with sound and light. The hum rose to a shriek, the signal warping into something raw and incomprehensible, like 1,000 voices screaming at once. The light from the machine surged, casting violent shadows that twisted and writhed across the walls. And then the voices spoke. They weren't human. They weren't even close. The words clawed their way into my mind, bypassing my ears entirely. I couldn't understand them, not exactly, but the meaning was clear. "You are not welcome here," Hayes screamed, his body convulsing as the light enveloped him. I tried to move, to pull him away, but my legs wouldn't respond. Martinez was yelling something, but her voice was drowned out by the deafening roar. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The light faded, the hum died, and Hayes was gone. Hayes was gone. Not dead, not in the way you'd expect. He hadn't burned or collapsed or screamed himself into unconsciousness. He disappeared. 1 second, he was there, his hand on the machine. The next, the space he'd occupied was empty, the air still vibrating faintly where he'd stood. I stared at the spot, my mind refusing to process it. "What just happened?" I croaked, my voice barely audible over the ringing in my ears. Martinez grabbed my shoulder, her nails digging in hard enough to hurt. "We need to go. Now." "But Hayes is gone," she snapped. "If we stay here, we will be too." Her words jolted me back to reality, and I stumbled after her as she turned and bolted for the ladder. The tunnel felt alive, the walls seeming to pulse in the dim light of our flashlights. Shadows moved where there shouldn't have been any, and the air grew heavier with each step, like the space itself was trying to crush us. When we reached the ladder, the hum returned. It started faint, a low vibration that barely registered, but it grew quickly, rising to a deafening roar that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. The machine's glow spilled out into the tunnel behind us, casting long, twisting shadows that writhed like living things. We scrambled up the ladder, Martinez barking at me to move faster even as the metal rungs trembled beneath our hands. I didn't dare look down, but I could feel it. Something was coming, something that wasn't bound by flesh or bone or the rules of our world. We burst out of the hatch, gasping for air like drowning men breaking the surface. The tower still loomed above us, its red light blinking steadily as if mocking us. The Humvee was a blur in the distance, barely visible through the thickening fog. Then the voices started. They weren't coming from the tower or the jungle or the machine below. They were coming from inside us, a cacophony of whispers and screams that seemed to echo through my skull. They spoke in fragments, disjointed phrases that didn't make sense but filled me with a primal, bone-deep terror. "You opened the door. You don't belong here. It sees you. Martinez shoved me toward the Humvee, her face pale and set in a grim mask. "Run!" she shouted, and I didn't need to be told twice. The fog seemed to cling to us, slowing our steps, but we made it to the vehicle. Martinez threw herself into the passenger seat, her rifle clattering to the floor as she slammed the door. I gunned the engine, the tires spinning uselessly for a moment before catching on the soft earth. As we sped away, I caught a glimpse of the tower in the rearview mirror. The red light was no longer blinking. It was steady now, glaring like an unblinking eye, and beneath it, in the clearing, something moved. Something tall and skeletal, its limbs too long and its gait too smooth. It turned toward us, and even from that distance, I felt its gaze like a weight pressing down on my chest. The drive back to the base was a blur. The voices faded as the tower disappeared behind the hills, but the hum lingered, a faint vibration that never quite left my bones. Martinez didn't speak, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of her seat. When we reached the base, we didn't bother with protocol. We didn't even unload our weapons. We just walked straight into the comms room and transmitted a single message to command. Facility compromised. Immediate evacuation required. Do not approach. They didn't listen. Of course they didn't. A week later, the base was decommissioned, officially due to budget cuts. Martinez and I were reassigned, our reports buried under layers of bureaucracy and classified nonsense. But I still hear it sometimes, the hum. Late at night, when the world is quiet and the air is still, I feel it vibrating in my chest, just faint enough to ignore if I try. And when I do, I know it's watching.